Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm C.E. Gatchalian. I'm the guest 2S LGBTQIA plus curator for Word Vancouver this year. Um, I just want to begin by acknowledging that Word Vancouver takes place on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I want to pay tribute to these nations' storytellers who continue to pave the way for all of us. Um, some thank yous are in order to our sponsors, to Word Vancouver sponsors. A special thank you to Connects UBC, the UBC Library, and UBC Robson Square for their sponsorship, which made the space available to us. Um, I would like to take a moment to thank our generous donors and sponsors, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Seawill, Payson Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, and the Writers Union of Canada. For a full list of our partners, please visit Word Vancouver's website. Without you, this free festival could not happen. So if you haven't already, please consider making a donation via Word Vancouver's website. So welcome everyone to the session, which is called The Personal and the Political. I think the title is self-explanatory. So without further ado, because we have limited time, I think we can start our readings. We have from featuring our two readers today, Dan Gawthrop and Nelson Augustin. So yeah, we're going to start with Dan. I call him Dan because he's a friend. So Daniel Gawthrop's first novel, Double Karma, was published by Cormorant Books this spring. Described by Literary Review of Canada as, quote, a fast-paced, compelling narrative, unquote, and by British Columbia Review as, quote, remarkable, a novel that matters, unquote. It explores themes of identity, love, and loss within the historical and political context of a country, Burma/Myanmar, perpetually in crisis. Gawthrop is also the author of 5 nonfiction titles, including The Rice Queen Diaries, The Trial of Pope Benedict, which both published by Arsenal Pole Press, and Affirmation, The AIDS Odyssey of Dr. Peter, published by New Star. He lives in New Westminster, traditional Coast Salish territory of the Kakite First Nation. So please welcome Daniel Gawthrop.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Just by way of introduction, before I get into the piece for context, so the story follows the first-person narration of Min Lin, who's a Burmese American photographer who has never been to Burma before. His father's from there, and he goes in 1988, just before the uprising, and he gets stuck there and comes face to face with his doppelganger, someone who looks exactly like him. And that person is killed, and he is later mistaken for this person, a soldier, Burmese army soldier, by the Burmese army, and wakes up in a hospital where he has to pretend he's playing along. And so the first piece I'm going to read is from a moment. He's also I got to tell you this part too quickly. He fell in love with a woman who was a nursing student who got arrested and is in jail for a long time. So he's at the office 8 months or so after he gets picked up by the army, and he's working now for the regime. November 1989, Rangoon, Min. Late one afternoon, I was alone in the darkroom, running some prints through the chemical bath when the office phone rang. Some Kalar was here to see me, the private at reception informed me. Says he's an old friend. Not good, I thought. Such an impromptu visit from an Ong Win acquaintance was bound to happen. Ong Win is the name of the one who was killed, who he's been mistaken for. Sorry. It was bound to happen, but I hadn't prepared for such a surprise at work. And my first visitor was from the Indian race. This would raise eyebrows among my peers, all of whom were ethnic Burmans who shared the private's casual and examined racism. So I told him to pass on my apologies and say I was busy. Then I hung up. Moments later, the phone rang again. His name is Syed Hossein, the private informed me. He insisted I would want to see him. I instructed him to send the man through. What the hell else was I going to do? My office door opened and the stranger walked in. Syed Hossein's presence was instantly disarming. He was quite young, 17 or 18, I guessed, and a few inches shorter than me. He's 27 at this point. Lean and well-groomed, wearing slacks and a silk shirt. Syed Hossein was not merely handsome, but astonishingly so. He had great bone structure, a perfect set of sparkling white teeth, and a curly black mop of hair that shone as if the sun followed him everywhere. How did this kid know Ong Win? I welcomed him by name, perhaps a little too heartily, for the disappointment registered immediately in the dark brown pools of his matinee idle eyes. Syed Hossein said he was fine, but that I seemed different. Then, brushing aside the pleasantries, he asked what time I would be finished work. 5 o'clock, I said. Could I leave early? I looked at the clock. It read 4:30, and told him to wait a few minutes while I cleaned up and turned off the lights. Then he led me outside onto Strand Road. We headed east on foot. When I asked where we were going, he shook his head in disbelief. We've gone there many times before, he said. You know it well. Then he gestured toward the promenade along the Rangoon River, noting how lucky I was to find a job so close to it. We used to take a bus here, he told me. Trying to think of something convincing to say, I apologized for my foggy memory, which hadn't been the same since the injury. He frowned. He knew that already, he said. Then, pointing at the river again, he directed me toward Botatong Pagoda. We continued walking in silence as we reached the gates, entered the temple grounds, and made our way down the road, past the shrine until we reached the river's edge. I began to feel awkward. Why would Ong Win have come here several times with this minority kid? There was nothing down here, nothing to see or do. Was Ong Win into drugs, and Syed Hossein was his dealer? He led me down a ramp onto the dock and then to a rusty, abandoned fishing boat. We stopped where the boat was tied up. Then he climbed a short ladder onto its portside deck, entering the cabin through a hatch. Reaching for my hand, he told me to climb up quickly before anyone noticed. What the hell? I thought, obeying. Once I joined him in the darkness, the boy abruptly pulled my face to his own and planted his tongue in my mouth. Startled, I pulled away. What was the matter? He wanted to know, confused. Didn't I love him anymore? Ah, so this was it. Of course, I told him. It was only that. He pulled my face toward his and kissed me again. This time I went along with it, surprised but alert, my tongue wrapping around his. My first instinct was to keep performing, strategic and task-oriented, focused only on doing whatever I thought Ong Win would do under the circumstance, something I now realized he must have done countless times with this enchanting young man. But soon I felt something else. The stirrings, the unmistakable stirrings of desire, prompted by the unexpected thrill of a first sexual encounter. As a teenager, I'd fantasized about boys I wanted to kiss, but pushed away such thoughts, persuaded by daily reminders from popular culture and my father's traditional ways that man-on-man love was wrong. Later, as the horrors of AIDS unfolded in the media and in homophobic society everywhere, I fought against gay feelings until convinced I'd stamped them out. Once in Burma and enthralled to Thander's charisma, I fooled myself into thinking I could marry a woman. But at 26 and still a virgin, I hadn't gone much further with my fiancée than an earnest peck on the lips. Nor since her arrest had I enjoyed an erotic moment with anyone else, not even at the rebel base in Mannerplow, a cauldron of male hormones with no shortage of blue balls among the many attractive young trainees sleeping beside me. Now here I was at 27, sharing a deep French kiss with another guy, some stranger from an ethnic minority, a most unlikely candidate for sex, one would think, given my lack of exposure to his people. I felt like I'd come home at last, and Syed Hossein was my one-man welcoming committee. His probing tongue behaved as if its owner knew every inch of me already. Lucky Ong Win. His full lips drawing me in with a tickle from the downy peach fuzz above them. The revelation of our coupling was beautiful and sad all at once, for I now understood the pleasure of the human need I'd denied myself for more than a decade. Until that moment, sex had seemed impossible. Now I knew that this version of it was what I'd always wanted. All these years later, I still get goosebumps recalling the moment I accepted that knowledge. I marveled at Syed Hossein's ability to communicate so much without saying a word, at how fervently he desired Ong Win. The transgressive nature of our encounter, the seedy public setting, the fear of being caught, only added to my excitement as our tongues kept mingling. As we kissed and caressed each other, I was clutching his buttocks when I noticed something in his right back pocket. Slipping my left hand into it, I found what felt like a credit card. For no reason but playfulness, I guess, I pulled it out and tucked it into the back of my longi without Syed appearing to notice. When we pulled apart, he looked at me longingly, evidently convinced that I was the young Win he remembered. Then he dropped to his knees and went straight for my longi, tugging it from the top and sliding it down my legs without seeing what I had taken from him. But suddenly, with my loins fully exposed, he recoiled. He was alarmed and demanded to know who I was. I did not understand what he meant. He shook his head and shuffled backward, moving further away. I was missing a scar. My scar? Yes, your scar. Ong Win has a big long scar, he said, pointing just above my pubic hair. He told me it was from a battle injury when Ong Win fell against a bamboo spear in a booby trap, a big brown scar. I had nothing on my skin. No sign, no trace. The heat of moments earlier, the electricity between us was gone. Within seconds, the promise of ecstasy with this beautiful boy was withdrawn. I looked down at the unblemished part of my body he was pointing to. I could not possibly be Ong Win, he said. He demanded to know who I was. I pulled up the longi, tied it in a knot, and looked away. After living successfully as an imposter for 8 months, I hadn't been directly challenged this way since that one soldier at the hospital in April, the one who filed a complaint after visiting me. Since then, not a single person had raised any doubts about my identity so directly. Now this Syed Hossein, alarmed by the discovery that I was not his lover, was confused and angry. I asked him for a cigarette, playing for time. He pulled out a pack of Red Ruby from his shirt pocket, took out a smoke, and threw it at me. When I caught it, he grudgingly dug out a match and lit it. I cut both my hands to his left one as he took the match to the cigarette, an intimate gesture now ruined by my exposure. Apologizing for the shock, I told him I had no idea who I was. All I knew was that I'd woken up in a hospital bed, not remembering anything, and that I'd been told I was Ong Win. I still could not recall anything from before the hospital, and had been trying to cope with this fact ever since. Syed Hossein absorbed my words, his delicate features tightening into a frown. I prayed he would believe me, but he didn't. It made no sense to Syed that I looked like Ong Win in every other way. He repeated his demand to know who I was. I took another drag from the cigarette before dropping it on the boat's dusty floor and stubbing it out. Just someone who's trying to keep his head above water in the new Myanmar, I said. His reply was direct. He could report me. He should report me. People at the ministry and others who knew Ong Win would be angry to learn that I was not him. I had run out of moves. I could not think my way out of this. Then I noticed something on the floor. The card I'd taken from the boy undetected while our lips were locked. Picking it up before he could grab it, I held it up to examine it. Hey, he shouted. That's my ID card. The laminated white card bore a faded black and white mugshot of a younger Syed Hossein with his vital stats. Birthplace, Akyab, Arakan State. Ethnicity, Bengali. He must have taken it out to show security at the Working People's Daily and forgotten to return it to his wallet. Give it back, he said, his anxiety growing. At that time, I don't think I'd ever heard the word Rohingya, but I had some sense that as a Bengali, a term the government had long adopted for its people, marking them as foreign. Syed Hossein did not belong to one of Burma's officially recognized minorities, and his white card was all that allowed him to stay in the country. It was his lifeline. There was no way he could leave this place without it, and soon he was begging for its return. I looked him in the eye. Are you going to report me? He seemed self-confident enough to do such a thing, although, as a member of a reviled minority with no citizenship status, his word might not be worth as much as the fake Ong Win's. Then he promised not to reveal my secret. How good was his promise? He stepped forward and brought his face back to mine. The kiss, which lasted almost half a minute, said this: You may not be Ong Win, and I don't like you for tricking me, but you're still pretty hot, and in better circumstances, we might be lovers. So no, I'm not going to rat you out. I promise, he said, pulling away again. I handed him the card. He turned toward the door. Wait, I said. If you're not going to report me, can we see each other again? He shook his head. He was sorry, but this was all too much. I was not Ong Win, and I could never replace him in his heart. And with that, he walked through the door and left me, to my everlasting regret, alone on that rusty old fishing boat. Now, how long was that about? Maybe I should have got you to time me because
We're still under.
We're okay so there's a much shorter piece that I wanted to read because it goes into the third person voice about Min Lin's father, Ko Lin Tun, from whom he has been estranged for some time, and he's learned some truths from him. But this is much later when he's back in the U.S. and he's resumed his career as a photographer. And there's a special exhibit he wants his father to see called Fathers and Sons. And the father still doesn't know that he's gay. And I'll just go into it as it starts. I think it was 179, I think it was, yes. Here we go, yeah. Ko Lin Tun arrived at the studio, its neon Karma Communications logo flashing above the front entrance. A smiling and confident Min greeted him at the door, taking his coat and hat before pouring him a glass of white wine. Then he led his father to the exhibition space. Start from where it says birth, he instructed. There's an order to all this, just like in life. Then, turning to his office, he left Ko Lin Tun alone to look at the photos, all large frames hung at or just below eye level. The pictures were black and white, which annoyed Ko Lin Tun. He saw this choice as pretentious, not particularly helpful to the viewer, and preferred to see color. But he kept that thought to himself as he began viewing the photos one by one. The first series featured several young men with their infant sons. For each family pair, the display featured candid shots taken at home, father and son playing on the floor, father feeding son, father dressing son, no mother present. And then one formal portrait taken in this studio of each father staring into the camera while carrying his baby boy. Ko Lin Tun was intrigued. Seeing the pride and joy in the eyes of every dad, the trust and adoration in the eyes of every little son, he recalled his own joy at the birth of Than Tun and his devastation at the death of his first son. Then he recalled his joy at Min's birth, how it was compromised by the distraction of having to escape the country a few hours later. Oops, I've given you a spoiler. The next session, called Youth, featured images of fathers appearing with their teenage sons. Ko Lin Tun slowly walked through a series of photos of a white father posing with his son, who has won a baseball championship, another one of an African-American father consoling his son after losing a football game, and another one showing a Latino father helping his son with his homework. Then he stopped at a series of photos showing a Chinese man with his son. The boy wore earrings, facial makeup, and clothes that made him look like a girl. The boy was clearly a homosexual. Ko Lin Tun's stomach churned. Looking around to see if Min was nearby, he wasn't. He began examining the images more closely. In one photo, the man was shopping at a cosmetics counter with his girly boy son. He didn't seem at all bashful. Another showed the two of them together at a pride parade, the father holding one end of a banner that read, "Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays." Another captured them at a restaurant in a candid moment of riotous mutual laughter. The final image, taken in Min's studio, showed the father standing behind the boy, who was sitting on a stool as they both faced the camera. The father had his arms wrapped around his son's chest. Both wore radiant, ear-to-ear smiles. Ko Lin Tun felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The first was irritation. Had Min invited him here to rub his politics in his face? He couldn't help thinking his son had staged the shoot with the Chinese father and son for propagandistic reasons. You see, Dad, Asians can be homos too. But then he studied the images again. The father's sincerity and earnestness came through. The bond with his son was undeniable. It then occurred to Ko Lin Tun that he was wrong not to have taken Min's profession seriously. He regretted having missed the boy's previous exhibition, for it was clear to him from these images and the ones from Burma that Min had enormous talent as a photographer. Such fine depth of vision and excellent instincts. How on earth had he managed to get so near to his subjects and capture them in complete authenticity, including in the pose shots? He thought again about the Chinese man who looked respectable and clean living, a man who clearly loved his homo son. There was no mistaking it in their proximity, their body language, their obvious pleasure in each other's company. The girly boy's son seemed happy, self-assured, in the knowledge that his father loved him. So much happier, it seemed, than his own son, or himself. Ko Lin Tun was stewing in this thought as he passed through the midlife section, which featured different sets of fathers and adult sons doing things together on a more equal basis. Fathers and sons attending the opera, sharing cooking duties, completing their respective tax returns from the same dining room table. Still distracted by those final pictures in Youth, he walked past most of these photos, then a few of the images in the late life section, before stopping at a photo of a middle-aged black man visiting his father in the hospital, holding his hand as a father sits up in bed, eyes moist with tears as he gazes upon his son. For the studio portrait of the two men together, Min shot them in the same pose as a Chinese father and son from youth, but in reverse position. The black son in late life stood behind his father, who sat on the stool holding a cane, with his arms wrapped around his father's chest. In the curatorial notes, Min said the father died a week later. These photos were the final testament to their love. Co-intern's eyes teared up. There were no words to describe what a beautiful thing Min had done by documenting the relationships between these two generations of men. Through such fine photography, his own son had made a powerful statement about the unbreakable bond between fathers and sons, including, he could not deny, fathers and their homo sons. He was proud of Min for producing such quality work, but struggled to find a way to tell him so, since he also suspected an agenda, a message Min was trying to send about himself. Despite his initial defensiveness about the exhibition, Colin Tun could hardly begrudge his own son for that. Min stepped out of the studio office carrying his own glass of white wine. He walked up to his father and clinked his glass, from which Colin Tun had barely taken a sip. So, Dad, what do you think? Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. And I should have done this at the very beginning. This is Dan's book, Double Karma. So please consider purchasing it. So our next reader is, let me just switch my glasses. These are getting old. Anyways, Nelson Augustin is a non-binary writer, graphic designer, and fine art photographer. An honors graduate from the University of the Philippines College of Fine Arts, they have worked in the fields of advertising, publishing, and marketing for more than 20 years. Nelson has independently created, wrote, designed, and published their photography books, novels, and poetry. Their alphabet book of Filipino food, A for Adobo, was published by Tahanan Books in 2010. On Amazon, they published their collection of flash fiction, The Door Knockers and Other Stories. Nelson resides and works on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, whose historic relationships with the land continue to this day. So please welcome Nelson Augustin.
I'm going to read about 5 stories because these are all flash fiction and they're a lot shorter narratives. But I'm going to take my time with these. The first story is the only story that I think that I wrote as a comedy. The rest of the stories I'm going to be reading is they're all going to be a lot more equal parts drama, equal parts horror. So this one has more comedy in it. So we're going to start with a comedy one. This is called Everyone Wants Dinner. Lorna stretched her massive leathery wings as she glided noiselessly over East Vancouver. The full moon was particularly bright that evening, and she was impatient to feed. She had just performed a sinister-sounding incantation that allowed her to sprout wings and sever her torso from her lower half, which she left standing in a secluded wooded spot in Coquitlam. She had much ground to cover. Her sharp eyes spotted a disheveled man passed out in the dimly lit alley behind Carnegie Center on Main and Hastings. Used syringe needles lay scattered near his hand. She stealthily swooped down and hovered in front of him. She was about to pierce his throat with her long ribbon-like tongue when he suddenly opened his eyes and screamed at the floating monstrosity before him. Lorna panicked. She grabbed the man and tried to shut him up with her blackened taloned fingers. But the man kept screaming, flailing, and waving his arms. "Hey, what's going on there?" A Vancouver police car had stopped at the alley, and 2 officers directed their high-beam beacons at them. "Ay, puta!" Lorna cursed as she released the struggling man and bolted straight up into the sky, bright shafts of light following her. "Did you see that?" One of the officers peered at the sky, his eyes wide with shock. "I don't know what I saw," the other officer muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Whatever it is, we need to capture it." "We have a situation here," the first officer said to his radio. Some sort of person on a glider, possibly armed. All units in pursuit. Puta! Lorna shouted in frustration as she wove between high-powered searchlights piercing the night sky. Two police helicopters tailed her in hot pursuit. Unit 2, we have the glider in sight. Over. Unit 1, please stand by as we confirm the attention measures. Over. Lorna increased her altitude and soared high above the clouds. It was freezing cold, and her thin cotton blouse provided no warmth. Why didn't she put on a windbreaker before she flew off? Unit 2, we may have lost the glider. Over. Unit 1, let's circle around for another 5 minutes. Over. Lorna continued gliding just above the clouds until the whirring chopper sounds faded. Grumbling hungrily to herself, she flew back to Coquitlam and headed toward the dark, secluded spot to rejoin her body. Ay, puta! She screamed again, gnashing her filthy, sharp teeth and pulling her static, frizzy hair. An enormous black bear was feasting on the steaming entrails of her lower half. The next one is called Swarm. Jules emerged from his cell, escorted by Constable Hawkins. Sonia and Yuling gasped when they saw his handsome brown face, lumpy with darkened bruises, his left eye swollen shut. What did you do to him? Sonia exclaimed, taking Jules into her arms. He did not hug her back. He simply stood there and laid his head on her shoulder. What happened to him? Yuling demanded, facing Constable Hawkins. Why did you beat him up? We never beat him up, Constable Hawkins said, his face remaining impassive. His eyes glinted like wintry steel, his jaw seemingly set in an eternal grimace. He was resisting arrest. For what? Yuling couldn't get over her shock. She looked at Jules and back to Constable Hawkins. He's just a boy. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Ma'am, we have to stop his car and ask him a few questions. Ask him what? Driving while black? A brief glimmer of anger flashed over the constable's eyes, but he held his neutral, impassive stance. He ran through a red light. We wanted to give him a ticket, but he became agitated. We decided to bring him to the station, but he resisted arrest. Is this really true? Yuling turned to Jules in disbelief. But Jules remained standing in Sonia's arm, his head on her shoulder. Yuling felt her fury bubbling through her, as she glared at Constable Hawkins, an angry mouthful of obscenities at the tip of her tongue. Yuling held her hand and gently called her name. Yuling, please. She turned to Sonia and met her worried, soulful brown eyes. Oh, Sonia. She felt her fury subsiding. She let out a sigh. Let's go home, Sonia declared as he turned to leave. Have a nice evening, Constable Hawkins said cheerily behind them. Yuling stiffened and clenched her hands into fists. Something in her snapped. She fell behind Sonia and Jules as they went through the police station doors and into the parking lot. She paused near the doors and spotted a cockroach crawling on the door handle. Gingerly, she swept the cockroach into her cupped hands. She whispered to it a string of incomprehensible words. The words came from a time long ago when the pristine beaches of her home province, Siquijor, were undisturbed by Spanish colonizers. Words that were passed down to her by the powerful matriarchs of her clan. She released the cockroach to the floor, watching it scuttle away and pass through a crack in the wall. She finally pushed the doors open and joined her waiting family in the car. So, time has passed. Yuling! Sonia called out to her above the noise of the TV. Come over here! Jules was on the couch, watching the morning news, a bowl of cereal in his hand. Sonia was standing beside the couch, her hands on her hips. Her lips were pursed, and her eyes searched Yuling's questioningly. Did you have anything to do with this? She gestured at the TV. The morning anchor reported that the entire police force was brought to Vancouver General Hospital for circumstances that could not be explained. Close quotes. The TV screen cut to a footage of Constable Hawkins on the hospital bed, convulsing as a swarm of cockroaches continuously crawled out of his purple mouth. Screams could be heard in the background. Well, Sonia raised an eyebrow at her. Yuling didn't answer. Instead, she bent down, kissed Jules' forehead, and affectionately ran her fingers through his hair. The next couple of stories are actually sort of connected. The um, the main character, Lola Banding, I actually based her on my actual grandmother. She's already passed away, but she was really nice to me. So it's my way of immortalizing her in these stories. So the next story is called Headless. Lola Banding didn't know if it was a trick of the light or if her eyes had gotten worse, but she clearly saw Chico walk past her without his head. It was a weird sight. Chico's stout torso, covered in a fuzzy blue sweater, swiveled at the waist, his jean clad legs walking without a hitch. He just didn't have a head. Chico, hijo, she called out to him. What is it, Ma? His annoyed face snapped back into view. Lola Banding's eyes went wide. Hijo, don't go out, she said, clutching his blue sweater. Let go, he said, pulling his sweater free. I have to go, Ma. Julia and the kids are waiting for me. Can't you stay for another hour or so? Lola Banding reached for his sweater again, but Chico swerved out of her reach. There's still a terrible windstorm outside. There's been uprooting trees in Stanley Park. Ma, I need to go home, he said. I'll be okay. He reached for his car key on the kitchen counter, but Lola Banding mustered enough strength to speed up and snatch the key away from his grasp. Ma! He frowned at her. He put his hands on his hips. I have no time for games. What's the matter with you? No, nothing, hijo, she muttered, turning away from him, shuddering. You're really acting strange, Chico said, exasperated. He turned her around and felt her shivering, her eyes bugging with fright. He softened his stance and gently prodded her. Ma, please tell me what's wrong. You won't believe me even if I told you, she whimpered, looking away. Try me, he insisted. She let out a heavy sigh and looked at him. I just saw you without a head. Chico's eyes narrowed. What do you mean without a head? You were headless, she said, clutching him closer. Pugot! Hijo, please don't go. Something bad will happen to you. Ma, what are you talking about? He shook his head at her. Look at me. My head is still here. I told you not to watch Jessica Soha's stupid Halloween specials on TV. It's true, hijo, it's true. She grabbed the sides of his head and started crying. This is Vancouver, Ma. We have fiber optic internet and swift mobile phones. There is no room for superstitions in our lives. Please, hijo, just stay in tonight. She clutched his sweater again. Please don't go. Suddenly, there was a loud whoosh and the sound of glass smashing outside. They raced to the window. They raced to the window. A fallen tree branch had speared through the windshield of the car and into the driver's seat. Chico went pale, and as Lola Banding wailed. The next story is called Scent of Roses. The Scent of Roses. A drop of crimson bloomed from where a large thorn had pierced Lola Banding's arthritic thumb. She winced and immediately stuck on the thumb. She was kneeling amid her prized rose bushes that surrounded a particularly high, mossy mound in her backyard. Banding, you should have been more careful. Lola Banding turned around to see an old man shuffling towards her, cane in one hand. His face was a mahogany map of deep wrinkle lines, his beard a cascade of silver spilling over the stiff collar of his burgundy tweed coat. Luminous dark brown eyes regarded her with a hint of mischief. I can't help it, Manon, she sighed. They are so beautiful, but not as beautiful as you, he smiled, reaching out to touch her lumpy face. Lola Banding blushed and swatted his hand away. Oh, don't tease me, Manon, she said, giggling. I'm only telling you the truth. Manon kept smiling. He held out his arm, which Lola Banding grasped to pull herself up. I see you're smelling your roses again. They're exquisite, aren't they? Lola Banding closed her eyes and sniffed the air. The morning was warm and sharply brilliant, her garden especially vivid. The scent of roses wafted lazily in the air. You did a great job tending to these roses, Banding, Manon said, sniffing the air as well. You have made me very happy. Lola Banding smiled at him, but then faltered. She let out a sigh. What's wrong? He peered at her wistful face. Did I speak out of turn? No, you silly man. She broke out in a smile. She broke out in a smile again, showing her yellow dentures. I'm happy I made you happy. It seems that I haven't made anyone happy for a long time. Manon took her hand and kissed it. His hand felt warm and comforting in hers. I think it's time you come with me, Banding, he said quietly. Lola Banding shook her head. No, I can't. Chico, my grandchildren, they still need me. I still want to see them. Banding, Manon gently persisted, kissing her hand a second time. What are you really doing here in Vancouver? Aside from Chico and his family, you do not know anyone here. You don't even speak the language. I wanted to be closer to Chico, she started to cry. Chico has his own family now, his own life. He hushed her, bringing her closer to his arms. Oh, Banding, he continued gently, smoothing her gray hair. It breaks my heart to see you alone and wandering about in the city. I do not like how these white idiots dismiss you every time you ask for help. They do not even try to understand you. She felt the rumble of an ancient primordial energy surging in his hand. She broke from his grasp as if she touched a burning lump of coal. She turned away from him and started crying again. I do not know what to do, she murmured, wiping her tears. The roses, they are the only things that keep me going every single day. A gentle breeze disturbed the roses, and another whiff of her intoxicating sweet scent trailed in its wake. Won't you join me, Banding? Manong gently asked again, holding out his brown, gnarly hand. Lola Banding gazed longingly at her magnificent roses in full bloom. They seemed to be singing to her. Oh, I'm going to miss the scent of roses, she exclaimed, before turning to Manong and accepting his hand. How are we doing for time? I'm going to do one last story, the title story, The Door Knockers. Oh, here we are. The knock on the door was insistent. Keon frowned and looked at the time on his phone, 8:30 p.m. He paused the Netflix show he was watching and got up to open the door. Three people stood outside, a young woman with a round face and long sleek hair, an elderly man with a chiseled jaw and weathered features, and another elderly man with shiny bald head and droopy jowls. They all wore heavy black robes. They gazed at him with solemn expressions. What is this? He demanded. What do you want? The young woman spoke, her voice the sound of having smoked too many cigarettes. We have a message from your father. Is this some kind of joke? Kean bristled. He slammed the door in their faces and went back to his couch. He paused the show and found he could not concentrate on what he was watching. Damn you, father. There was a knock on the door again. Kean didn't move but frowned with irritation. Another insistent knock. Go away, he bellowed, turning up the volume of his TV. There were a couple more knocks and then silence. Kean's eyes remained riveted on his Netflix show, but his mind played the scene in a hellish loop. His father's shocked face when he revealed to him that he is gay. He abruptly turned off the TV. He swallowed a couple of sleeping pills, doused all the lights, and tried to drown past in a murky gray sleep. A knock on his bedroom door bolted him awake from a dreamless slumber. He grabbed his phone and squinted at the time, 2:50 a.m. What the fuck? He swore silently, scowling at the second insistent knock. He got up and flung open his bedroom door. The same trio stood before him. How did you get in? He yelled. I'm calling the police. His fingers fumbled for his phone but dropped it. We have a message from your father, the young woman intoned. I don't care what he has to say, he cried. He tried to push them away, but they wouldn't budge. He felt as if he was pushing against a stone wall. We have a message from your father, she repeated. Kian closed his eyes and willed himself not to cry. He yelled the same words his father said to him before he stormed out of their ancestral home in Manila. Get out of my house! But the trio remained standing, unmoving, unyielding. What do you want? They gazed at him intently, all of them slightly cocking their head to one side at the same time. He says he's very sorry, the chisel-jawed man began, his voice a trembling baritone. He says he loves you very much, the bold, droopy-jawed man added in a reedy, high-pitched tone. He says goodbye, the young woman finished. The trio then turned around and slowly floated out of the house.
Thanks, Nelson. Thanks, Dan. Before we start our chat, I just wanted to acknowledge that in the printed program, you might have noticed that there was another author who was supposed to join us today, Tawahum. Unfortunately, Tawahum is unable to join us today. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So yeah, let's chat. The title of this session is The Personal and the Political. So, I would identify both of your books as political. Dan's, I think yours is, explicitly political, but I would, Nelson, I think your book is very political too. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Do you think there's any such thing as apolitical writing, or is everything ultimately political? Do you think? Who wants to start?
I can venture an opinion.
Yeah.
But if you're writing for like I don't know, like a scientific journal or a medical journal, those writings are as dry as you can.
Yeah.
But if you're writing a narrative, it's almost impossible not to be political, because a lot of it has to do with not only with lived experiences, but also a lot of it has to do with your feelings and how you interact with the world. And a lot of it will actually feed into whatever you're writing. So I guess most writing can be political, in my opinion. If you want to be completely apolitical, it just goes in the realm of more factual writing that's relegated to medical journals and such.
Yeah. Although some would argue that there's politics in that.
There is, though. Yeah, there is for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the writing is just so dry. I just don't want to read it. So.
Well,
Yeah, of course.
I know people who would say that, sure, no, there is lots of writing that can be apolitical. You can be writing about aesthetics, but even there, I would argue that, depending on what you're saying about what your aesthetic is, it's informed by a sensibility that comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
And usually maybe class comes into it. And if class enters into it, then it's politics.
Mm-hmm. So. So you're, as socially engaged writers, does it all start with an impetus to tell a story? Or is the impetus first to explore a political situation or agitate for political change?
Well, it depends on the work, on the project, right? This one in particular very much did come from the need to tell a story about that situation, because initially I was going to write a nonfiction book.
Yeah.
And I had 3 different nonfiction ideas, but they, while I was, working full time as a union communications rep, all 3 of those ideas got picked off by other writers.
Yeah.
So eventually I just had to, come up with something, a story. And so it became somebody who gets stuck in Burma and the consequences of that. And the story grew from there in that case.
Interesting you mentioned that, because this actually started out as like a series of writing exercises, specifically with flash fiction. However, I'm very much enamored with fantasy, especially with the Filipino mythology. However, I did. I mean, everyone, well, at least most Filipinos, some Filipino writers I know have written so much about the lore, but I really wanted to put like a twist to it. Like, how do these mythological beings, um, what happens if we put them here in the North American setting? What happens to them? How do they how do they how do they interact with everyone else? For me, that's far more interesting. I and I started writing in that context, and then added a lot more layers to that: the immigrant diaspora, the LGBTQ, the struggles with LGBTQ folks, as well as the struggle, as well as the struggles of immigrants coming here.
It's great fodder for surrealism too, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is also metaphor, in my opinion, because having these mythological beings, they themselves have their own sort of power. They definitely have their own power, in from where they came from. But it kind of makes you wonder, how much power do they have once they arrive here, and how does it play, in the lives of these people?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that leads to my next question, Nelson, which is, your characters achieve such beautiful agency, right, in these stories, right? And they do so with the help of these figures from Filipino mythology and superstition. So, which is a strong artistic choice. What what do you want readers to take away from that?
I I think I wanted readers to understand, um, uh, on a much basic level, what an immigrant goes through, being uprooted from the place where they were born and grew up with, and then suddenly being you know transported, or rooted transferred the roots into another place. I A lot of that experience has to do with feeling disoriented and feeling othered, and feeling that they're still kind of like the outside or the fringe of society they're supposed to integrate with. The As I mentioned earlier, this mythical beings slash I guess part of a superstition. They they are metaphors. There are metaphors to. It's kind of like kind of like a reminder, or kind of like an umbilical cord to where they're from. It's kind of like a reminder that they don't necessarily have to change themselves, or they not necessarily have to give up their power if just because they're immigrants and they don't know what they're supposed to do. They can still be themselves, and 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 still. The one takeaway, I guess, when I was writing this, that I realized that coming here, that I didn't really have to change myself. I could add layers to myself coming here, and that's kind of like what I wanted to say in this book, that wherever you go, you can still be yourself. You can take on other manners for yourself, but you can, at the very core, you don't have to give up that part of yourself for you to be able to live an experience in a different place.
Um, Now, Dan, I mean, you're writing from outside of your direct lived experience. which is a controversial thing to do these days because your protagonist is a Asian male, right? Gay male, but an Asian gay male. So how was this process for you, and how did you do this ethically in your
Okay.
book, and what has the response been? from
Okay.
readers?
Well, first, before I get into that, I got to tell you there's an irony about this too, because last night I was at a launch for a book called The Family Code by a Toronto author, a Chinese Canadian author, Wayne Eng. And he expressed a great deal of concern about his appropriation because his character is a single white mother and first person, right? And he spoke about how he had been working as a social worker for 30 years and that he knew people exactly like this and had a lot of very deep, close personal exposure to them. So for me, I mean, one of the things that I tell people about my process with Double Karma is that, first of all, and he had mentioned the same thing, a Burmese male. I said, yes, but a Burmese American male. That's the first part around. So his sensibility is largely Western informed when he makes the trip. Although, having said that, I'm not out of the woods yet, because I've still got his father, who was born in Burma and raised there, and also Thander, the woman that he falls in love with, who's never set foot in the West. And so, really, a lot of what I went through around this process of the story was having to basically do my homework, and basically, really, it started well before the book even happened. So I've had a kind of an interest in Burma, Myanmar by the time I started writing it, since basically 88 when it happened. But I had closer exposure while living in Bangkok for 4 years, working at a newspaper where there were stories about Burma. And then it got closer for me when I went up to the border area and interviewed Shan migrants, really refugees, but couldn't be recognized as such, who were being returned. And I interviewed several of them. And then later I did. I'm giving the whole resume here. But later it was a master's thesis on exiled indie media of ethnic media groups, interviewing them. And the big part of it really, though, was being in a personal long-term relationship with a Burmese man from Karen State, Loon, my husband. It's been 21 years. And every day being with him, having some sense, that relationship is informed by the impact of his upbringing in many ways. So the homework was the biggest part of it.
Yeah. 5 minutes. Okay. It's 5 minutes. Any questions, comments from the audience? No. Let's try something new. Are there any questions you want to ask of each other?
I'll start. I'll be gentle.
Okay.
I feel like Barbara Walters.
Right. Yes. Okay, Barbara.
We've known each other for a long time, and we understandably the journey of your novel has gone through several permutations.
Oh, good.
We've talked about it a couple of times. I'm just wondering again. So how did it come now to this final format?
Well, Nels, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because there's another person here who happens to be in the audience who gave me some particular advice on how I should make my main character. And I didn't listen to her at first because, Min Lin began as a cis male heterosexual character. And there was some disbelief about the relationship with him and Thander. And so Corellin suggested that he be gay. And I said, this book isn't about me, Corellin, I said. And sometime later, I was convinced to attempt a trans character. And you and I talked about that.
We talked about it, yeah.
And I went down the road, a fair bit down the road, to look at it, and interviewed some people, paid them for their time, had a sensitivity reader, did all those things. Until, to cut the long story short here, until at the very end I realized I didn't have the grounding, even though I'm in the LGBTQ, etc., 2S, all of that, the community. That didn't make me an expert on trans issues, certainly not to the extent that I am on Burmese issues. So really, I had to kind of take another look and step back from that. And in the end, when my publisher suggested that I make him gay, my first reaction was, "Oh, Corella,
she was right all along.
She was right all along.
She has her nose
Yes.
on that. Yeah.
And I'm very glad that I took that advice eventually. So, thanks for
But
asking.
you only took the advice from someone who could publish you. You didn't take it from
Yeah.
your good friend and reader.
Yes. And I guess I'd ask you if we have another minute. Can you tell us about what maybe tease us with what you might be doing next?
Yes. So I'm attempting to write a novel. It's really hard. It's it's almost something that you mentioned earlier about. It's a love story between a Spaniard and a Filipino set against the Philippine Revolution. It's just the cause of the Philippine Revolution. I was actually wondering. I mean, because I'm writing it in the point of view of the Spaniard.
Okay.
I think I can get away with it,
Yeah.
but
get away with
but I'm having second thoughts. But in any case, the entire second act I've already written the entire second act. I was writing it in Mexico. I mean, it was a perfect place to write it in. But I was having a hard time with the first act setting it up because there's a lot of things going on, and I had to really read and be conscious of the history and be respectful to the actual history itself. It's gonna take me a while, but I do enjoy writing it because it's I'm writing it very differently. It's not as fast paced or sarcastic as the door knockers. It's the writing is a little bit more formal. And
You got to retain some of the bitchiness.
No, I can't. No. It's a little bit more literary, and I actually have to learn Spanish.
Okay. Great. Well, good luck with it.
Yeah. It's gonna be well.
It's great to hear that you're working on a novel. That's great.
Thank you.
Terrific. Okay. Well, any other questions? I think we're almost out of time, but 2 minutes. Okay. Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you
and
for inviting
please
us.
purchase their books, Nelson Augustin's The Door Knockers and Other Stories, and Daniel Gawthrop's Double Karma. So, and they're available
They're
for
available
sale
at 23
out,
books.
yeah.
32 books. Yeah.
outside this room, outside in the rink, I guess, also, and also outside on this floor. So, thank you very much for joining us. And there's still some events left, so I think we have
Including,
a couple of.
Including
And
this.
Carolyn's, Carolyn here is going to be reading in room 4C8. It's 485,
Yeah,
which
I
is the
won't-
hybrid. Yeah.
I won't be reading, Chris. I hate to correct you, but I'm going to be reciting.
You're reciting
From memory.
Yeah.
From memory.
yeah.
Oh, wow, that's an
love
extra
it.
value
Yeah, she's
added
amazing.
experience. Yeah, that's
It
great.
makes for a more,
Yeah.
it makes for a more high tension experience, especially when I stare off into space because I can't remember what you're fucking. You know, at this stage, it's a crapshoot.
It's a modern day event too. It's a hybrid event. So we have two authors from out of town who will be joining Carolyn. So
Awesome.
it'll be an experience. So that happens in half an hour at 4 o'clock in room C85, right? C485. So thank you very much for. Oh,
Thanks for putting this together, and this theme of appropriation is very, very topical and deserves a lot of thought, and I appreciate your insights.
great.
Thank you,
Yes,
James.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you. Thank you so much.